Welcome to our next lecture for research methods, where we are now going to cover components of the methods and how to actually write the methods section. So our primary objective are be able to identify those key components and then the order of Welcome to our next lecture for research methods, where we are going to review the writing of the methods section. And so for this lecture, the primary objective is going to be able to identify the key components of the methods and the different subsections within methods. So just to give you an idea, each research article you read, so original research article, is essentially going to have the same information. Now, some of it might be presented in different orders, but when you read a method section, you should be able to identify the study design, the participants, the instrumentation, the procedures, and then whatever data processing and statistical analysis was performed. So we've reviewed the study design in previous lectures. So this can be a randomized controlled trial, crossover, case controlled trial, or something else. But we're also going to want to include what the independent variables are. And so this is going to be a list of each independent variable and including the number of levels for each one. So for example, if you're interested in comparing the limbs for people, this can be 2 levels. You'll be comparing an injured limb versus an uninjured limb. If you have 3 different time points, your time could be a 3-level independent variable, where maybe you have a baseline, 1-week follow-up, and 1-month follow-up. So again, the number of levels is going to be unique depending on how many groups you're making and comparing among those groups. And then you've also got your dependent variables, which of course the outcome variables. So examples of this could be, did they sustain an injury, yes or no? Or it could be some type of quantification, such as measuring muscle strength. So if we take a look at an example from a paper that here you can see that participants completed a single visit. So this would be a cross-sectional study. And a 3-dimensional running analysis was performed under 3 different conditions. Okay, so you've got baseline, you've got plus 5% baseline, and plus 10% baseline. Okay, so the independent variable is going to be the cadence condition, and there are 3 levels of it. Now, the dependent variables are down in a different section in the outcome measures. And so here we're measuring the stance phase, kinematic, and kinetic data. And specifically, we've got running speed, cadence, step length, step width, and stance duration. But then we also have some ground reaction force variables, looking at braking force, vertical forces, and information like that. Okay, so these are all those outcome variables. The dependent variables are all specifically called out. And now in this scenario, since there are quite a few of them, they have their own independent section. You're also going to want to provide an overview of the participants. So like just the demographics. So the sex, the age, their health status, their activity levels, anything that kind of gives a description of who was targeted for the study. And then what was the recruitment scope? So where did these participants come from? Were they recruited from the community, from a college, from sports teams? So identifying where you went to actually find these participants. Now, there's some debate. Do you report the number of participants and their exact kind of average age, height, weight in the methods section? There's a shift saying, no, this belongs in the results section because this is actually an outcome of who you actually got to participate in the study. So really, the participants in the methods section is just an overview of who was targeted. This is also going to include our inclusion and exclusion criteria as well. So what criteria did the participants have to meet to be eligible for the study? And then how were they screened to know if they were eligible or not? And then the big part of human research is that there has to be informed consent. So the participants have to agree to participate in the study. And the research itself has to be approved by the IRB, which is an institutional review board, to say, hey, these methods are safe and sound and don't put the participants at more risk than harm, or at more risk of harm than of good outcomes. So if we take a look at that same study, so an example here, high school runners between the ages of 13 and 19 who participated on their school's cross-country team were recruited for the study. So here the inclusion criteria is they had to be in high school, they had to run on their cross-country team, and they had to be between the ages of 13 and 19. Exclusion criteria is they were excluded if they self-reported a running injury within the last 3 months. And then you can see here, there's even a definition of how a running injury was defined. But for this screening, it was just all self-reported. You see here that there's also a statement that participants signed informed consent. Now, since some of them were minors, they need parental permission as well. And the methods were approved by the institution, the university's IRB, prior to those participants enrolling in the study. Okay, so that kind of hits all those main criteria of the participant information that we are looking for. For instrumentation, this is going to be the equipment that was used to make the measurements. So this isn't how the equipment was used. This is just what equipment was used. We saved the how part for the procedures. And this can include any type of surveys that were used. So it can include pieces of equipment. It can include surveys, just anything that was used to make an assessment or capture data. And so here we've got an actual data acquisition where it shows that there was a 12 camera passive marker system used with 3 floor embedded force plates, and there were 43 retroreflective markers that were placed on the participant upper and lower body. Okay, so this was a motion analysis study, used a motion capture system with force plates and reflective markers. The procedures then is how the equipment was actually used, what was done to collect the data. So how were the data obtained? How were the tests administered and who administered the tests? What was the setup of the testing environment? Were there instructions that were given to the departments or to the participants? Were there different treatments that were applied to each of the groups? And now this might not be fully applicable, but if you are doing some type of randomized controlled trial, then there are going to be some treatments. And then if you are doing a randomized control trial, how did the randomization occur? How were people allocated into different groups? And was there any blinding to not influence the bias? So taking a look at the study again. So there is a protocol section here, and some of the main points are they ran at a prescribed speed. There was a 5-minute warm-up on a treadmill, and then they performed some familiarization runs over ground. Running speed was monitored, and there was verbal feedback if their running speed was too fast or too slow. 5 successful trials were then recorded for each side. Baseline condition didn't have any instructions. For the +5 and +10% conditions, they were trying to match their footsteps to a metronome. Again, they got a 5-minute acclimation period for each of those interventions and maintained the same running speed as before, and recorded 5 successful trials again. Okay, so those are some of the key points in it that kind of shows what was performed. Now, for the purposes of your research proposal, you're not going to really dive too much into the data processing and statistical analysis. That's a little more advanced than what this class is going to expect. But this essentially tells how were those outcome variables actually extracted? How did you get those numbers that you use for your comparison? And then what comparisons were performed? So for this study, the data was filtered using a low pass filter. There's a Helen Hayes marker set, which essentially tells how the body was modeled. It defines the X, Y, and Z coordinate system that was used, and then the different segments of trunk, pelvis, but then you have the hip, ankle, and knee joints. And then internal joint moments and powers were calculated with inverse dynamics. So that was kind of like the data processing itself. And then the analysis, so one leg was used randomly, and then you were comparing those outcomes among the conditions. And so since there were 3 different groups being compared, this would be an ANOVA. But again, this is the stats piece I'm not too worried about that for the purposes of this class. I just want you to be aware of or be familiar and identify we're going to compare these variables among these groups. And then just some overall tips and tricks for the methods. So refer to previous publications when you're identifying what type of methodology you want to use. If you do use something that's been previously used, include that as a citation as you're writing to kind of support the use of it. But then at the end, as you have it written and read through it, ask yourself, would a researcher be able to reproduce the study with the information I provide in this paper? If you answer yes, then you have essentially the essential information there. If you're like, I think so, what do you think is missing that could help to improve it? And so something you can even do is that you can give it to someone else to read and say, hey, do you think you'd be able to replicate this? If they say no, ask them what is missing. So that's an overview of the methods. Again, I recommend that you put together an outline before you come to class and start to write this up. A lot of this was already kind of started with that executive summary, so you can take that and try to build it up. Subsections are very beneficial as you put together a method. So it's okay to say, all right, this section's for participants, this one's for the instrumentation, this one's for the procedure, and this is for the analysis. And so it's totally fine to do that and even recommended. But again, start with that outline to get your kind of thoughts in mind. If you do have any questions, go ahead and write them down, bring them to class or post them on the discussion board, and we'll start to draft these methods when we meet next.